The date is etched into the digital logs of the Ukrainian 128th Mountain Assault Brigade at exactly 2:44 a.m., marking a moment where the tectonic plates of modern warfare shifted beneath the frozen crust of the Zaporizhzhia front. This landscape, scarred by years of relentless attrition and usually humming with the terrifying choir of Grad rockets and the dull thud of 152mm howitzers, suddenly fell into an eerie, unnatural silence that signaled a phenomenon defying every established manual of conventional combat. Through the grainy, white-hot infrared feed of a Shark reconnaissance drone, Ukrainian operators did not witness the expected explosions of a night raid or the frantic maneuvers of a retreat under fire, but rather a systematic and quiet surrender that suggested a localized coup d'état was unfolding in real time. In the deathly quiet of the gray zone, rows of heavy Russian armor were captured on thermal optics, being parked with engines killed and hatches left open, while white flags were zip-tied to radio antennas in a gesture that was less about defeat and more about a deliberate handover of the Empire's tools of destruction. This was not a mere tactical collapse, it was a logistical catastrophe of historic proportions, with initial intelligence assessments confirming the seizure of over 7,000 metric tons of high-grade Russian ordnance and hardware, enough firepower to fully equip 2 mechanized brigades for a month of high-intensity combat without firing a single defensive shot. The inventory list salvaged from the shadows of the Zaporizhzhia treelines reads like a funeral dirge for Russian military prestige, including over 45,000 rounds of 152mm and 122mm artillery shells still pristine in their original wooden crates, alongside 42 T, 72 B3 main battle tanks and 68 BTR, 82A armored personnel carriers that were delivered fully fueled and combat-ready. Perhaps most devastatingly for the Kremlin's strategic posture, 2 intact Krasuka for mobile electronic warfare systems, the very units Vladimir Putin once claimed would blind NATO satellites and render Western precision weapons useless, were handed over as trophies, now being dismantled by Ukrainian and Western engineers to strip away the last of Moscow's technological secrets. This massive windfall represents a backstab of existential proportions, proving that when 7,000 tons of steel and powder move from the aggressor to the defender in total silence, the great Russian war machine has ceased to function as a cohesive entity and has instead begun to cannibalize itself from the inside out. The optics of this betrayal create a polarized reality where President Volodymyr Zelensky stands as a global avatar of resilience in the mud of the Donbass, looking into the eyes of his soldiers with the empathy of a leader who shares their risk, while the tyrant in the shadows remains insulated within the Kremlin by a phalanx of sycophants and a 10-meter table. While the Russian soldiers at Zaporizhzhia have come to the grim realization that they are being used as expendable meat for a medieval land grab, their commander-in-chief is fed sanitized reports that mask a terminal rot, a disconnect that has turned the internal realization of the Russian rank-and-file into the Kremlin's greatest enemy. The tactical necrosis spreading through the Russian lines at Zaporizhzhia changes everything because this sector is the geographic linchpin of the 21st century battlefield. And by seizing this 7,000-ton windfall, Ukraine has effectively decapitated the supply chain of the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army. This event is not just a loss of equipment, but a psychological contagion that is spreading via encrypted channels across the 600-mile front, where the fear of NATO's HIMARS is now eclipsed by the paralyzing suspicion that one's own comrades have already sold their positions for a chance at survival. For the global audience, particularly those in the United States and Europe, this event serves as the ultimate validation of Western strategic investment, demonstrating that while Russia is fighting with the rigid, centralized mindset of 1945, Ukraine is operating in a decentralized, 2026 digital reality where the cost of occupation has become mathematically and morally unsustainable. The red alarm currently ringing within the walls of the Kremlin is not merely the result of a lost battle, but the sound of the social contract between the Russian state and its warriors being incinerated in the fires of a failing autocracy. We are witnessing a moment where the spirit of an army simply evaporates, documented in 4K resolution, proving that Putin's forces are no longer a cohesive military force, but a collection of desperate individuals realizing they are on the wrong side of history. As these 7,000 tons of captured gear are repurposed and integrated with Western fire control systems to be turned back toward their maker, the world must ask how a nation once thought to fall in 3 days managed to turn the Russian soldier into its most effective logistics provider. This transition into a state of total internal defiance sets the stage for a deeper investigation into the specific technological and psychological cyber siege that fractured the Russian soul, leading to the secret algorithm of defiance that will be explored as we uncover how Ukraine turned Russian steel into an albatross around Putin's neck. The systematic surrender of 7,000 tons of high-grade Russian weaponry at the Zaporizhzhia front is not an accident of fate, nor is it merely a result of individual cowardice. It is the crowning achievement of a sophisticated Ukrainian strategy known as internal strike, external pressure. A masterclass in modern warfare where cognitive algorithms and human empathy have effectively dismantled the brute, archaic muscle of the Kremlin. Ukraine has fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement, proving to the global community that they do not just fight with kinetic munitions, but with a lethal combination of predictive mathematics and psychological precision that has turned the Russian soldier's own survival instinct into a weapon against the state. By leveraging the omnipresent Starlink satellite network and a swarm of micro-drones that saturate the digital airspace above the trenches, Kyiv has established a safe surrender corridor that functions with the efficiency of a high-tech logistics firm, offering Russian conscripts a binary choice: certain death under the command of a detached Moscow elite or a guaranteed lifeline through a QR code dropped directly into their foxholes. The capitulation of the Zaporizhzhia garrison was the climax of a multi-week operational strangulation where Ukrainian special operations forces utilized deep strike precision to isolate Russian units from their food, fuel, and medical supplies, creating a vacuum where the grand imperial promises of Vladimir Putin began to dissolve into the reality of starvation and abandonment. When the belly is empty and the ammunition crates are dry, the hollow rhetoric of Great Russia becomes a cruel joke, and the sheer humanity displayed by the Ukrainian "I Want to Live" program becomes an irresistible siren song for men who have been treated as expendable fodder by their own generals. This strategic isolation transformed the 7,000 tons of cached weapons from assets into liabilities for the Russian soldier. These shells and tanks were no longer tools of victory, but heavy anchors of a failed ideology that they chose to trade for the simple, profound promise of a hot meal and a phone call home to their families. Zaporizhzhia serves as the surgical jugular of the entire Russian occupation, a vital land bridge connecting the Donbass to occupied Crimea. And the loss of such a massive stockpile in this specific sector is equivalent to snapping the spinal cord of Russia's entire southern group of forces. From a logistical standpoint, the humiliation is absolute. The Kremlin spent 6 grueling months of industrial exertion, bypassing international sanctions and draining its national treasury to accumulate this 7,000-ton mountain of steel, only to see Ukraine decapitate that investment and take full operational control in less than 6 hours. The strategic math is devastating for Moscow, as every 152mm howitzer surrendered is not just a lost Russian gun, but a gained Ukrainian battery that will now rain Russian-made fire onto the very defensive lines they were built to protect, directed with surgical accuracy by Ukrainian digital fire control specialists. This collapse exposes the terminal necrosis of the paper bear military doctrine, a rigid, top-down Soviet-era relic that is being systematically dismantled by Ukraine's agile, decentralized digital warfare model, which operates as a singular, sophisticated organism, while Putin's commanders languish in a state of paralyzing distrust, fearing both the Ukrainian drones above and the firing squads of the FSB behind them. The Ukrainian military functions with a horizontal command structure that empowers the individual soldier with real-time intelligence and autonomous decision-making capabilities. The rebellion at Zaporizhzhia is the most visible symptom of a broader systemic failure within the Russian Federation, illustrating that when the frontline warrior ceases to believe in the righteousness of the tyrant, the most formidable arsenal in the world becomes nothing more than scrap metal waiting for a new owner. We are witnessing the death of an empire in high definition, where the sophisticated algorithm of Defiance has successfully hacked the psychology of the Russian occupier, turning their fear of death into a catalyst for the preservation of Ukrainian sovereignty. The sheer scale of this tactical victory radiates far beyond the trenches of Zaporizhzhia, acting as a signal flare to every other demoralized unit across the 1,000-kilometer front that there is an exit strategy from Putin's madness. By prioritizing the preservation of life through technological superiority, Ukraine has seized the moral high ground and the strategic initiative simultaneously, forcing the Kremlin into a defensive crouch from which there is no foreseeable recovery. This shift represents a fundamental realignment of global power dynamics, where the world is learning that a nation's strength is not measured by the weight of its tanks, but by the clarity of its purpose and the sophistication of its connectivity. The 7,000 tons of captured weaponry are now being integrated into a Frankenstein arsenal, Russian hardware guided by NATO standard intelligence, creating a hybrid force that is more lethal than the sum of its parts. As the dust settles on the Zaporizhzhia handover, the reality of a Ukrainian victory becomes not just a possibility, but an impending geopolitical certainty that the Kremlin can no longer hide from its own people. However, the implications of this event extend far beyond the immediate battlefield metrics, as this seismic shift is currently sending tremors through the international financial markets and the high-stakes tables of global diplomacy. The realization that the Russian military is no longer a reliable instrument of state power is forcing a massive reevaluation of sovereign risk, energy dependency, and the long-term viability of the Putin regime itself. The world is watching a live-streamed collapse of a superpower, a spectacle that is redrawing the maps of influence from Beijing to Washington. And as the economic fallout begins to mount, the true cost of this special military operation is finally coming home to roost in the empty coffers of the Russian elite. This is no longer just a story of soldiers in the mud. It is a global economic and geopolitical earthquake that is shattering the foundations of the post-Cold War era, leading us into a terrifyingly clear vision of a world where the Baochua in the shadows is finally left with nothing but his own delusions. The staggering loss of 7,000 tons of high-grade military hardware at Zaporizhzhia is far more than a localized tactical blunder. It is a seismic economic shockwave that has effectively decapitated the Kremlin's long-term defense budget and shattered the myth of Russian industrial resilience. In the cold, hard calculus of modern warfare, each surrendered T-72B3 tank and every crate of precision-guided munitions represents millions of dollars in Russian taxpayer contributions, wealth extracted from a struggling populace, now being unceremoniously handed over to the very enemy they were meant to destroy. This massive wealth transfer on the battlefield is a direct indictment of Vladimir Putin's leadership, exposing a fundamental incompetence where Russia's dwindling national treasures are being literally thrown out the window by a demoralized and disenfranchised officer corps. From the halls of Washington to the corridors of Brussels, Western powers are witnessing a once-in-a-century strategic opportunity: the total degradation of Moscow's conventional military threat without the deployment of a single NATO infantryman, as the Russian military provides its own destruction through internal rot and mass defection. This economic hemorrhaging is occurring simultaneously with the rise of the Zelensky vision, a strategic beacon that has redefined the parameters of the global liberal order. President Volodymyr Zelensky has evolved from a wartime leader into the ultimate guardian of democratic stability, demonstrating that the defense of Ukraine's borders is, in fact, the frontline defense of the entire free world. Every meter of scorched earth reclaimed by Ukrainian forces, and every Russian stockpile seized, serves as a testament to the power of righteous might, the idea that a nation anchored in truth, transparency, and technological ingenuity can crush the hollow Baoguin of a nuclear-armed autocracy. The international community owes a profound debt of gratitude to Ukraine through their blood and brilliance. They have stripped away the Kremlin's mask, revealing that the great Russian power is little more than a bloated, hollow phantom, a gargantuan specter of the Cold War that has been rendered obsolete by the sheer moral and digital superiority of a liberated people. As we analyze the strategic horizon, the conclusion becomes inescapable. The Zaporizhzhia rebellion is the definitive beginning of the end for the Putin era. We are no longer standing at a mere turning point, but at the threshold of a new chapter in human history where the Russian mirage has finally evaporated. When the psychology of mutiny becomes more contagious than the fervor of nationalism, and when the aggressor's own weapons become the primary resource of the defender's liberation, the ultimate failure of the Kremlin is no longer a matter of if, but when. The strategic paralysis now gripping Moscow is terminal. They cannot trust their soldiers to fight. They cannot trust their generals to report the truth. And they can no longer trust their weapons to remain in Russian hands. This historical pivot proves that a nation's true strength is not found in the quantity of its iron, but in the quality of its convictions and the adaptability of its intellect. The Battle of Zaporizhzhia will be immortalized in military academies for centuries as the ultimate example of asymmetric collapse, where a supposedly smaller nation utilized high-level intelligence and human dignity to force a crumbling empire to disarm itself. It is the story of David not just slaying Goliath, but convincing Goliath's own armor to join the fight for freedom. This conflict has transcended the boundaries of a territorial dispute to become a universal struggle for the reclamation of human dignity against the crushing weight of oppression. The reset Nong Sung, the rusted barrels of Putin's past-century ambitions have proven no match for the luminous truth and cutting-edge technology of the Ukrainian present. As we conclude this deep-dive investigation, we must recognize that the events in Zaporizhzhia serve as a thunderous warning to every autocrat who believes that brute force can extinguish the flame of liberty. The future belongs to the connected, the transparent, and the brave. The era of the shadow tyrant is drawing to a close, eclipsed by the brilliant light of a Ukraine that has already won the most important battle, the battle for the soul of the international order. Editorial conclusion: the war in Ukraine is not merely a fight for land, it is a war to reclaim human dignity in the face of tyranny. What is unfolding in Zaporizhzhia is the most forceful warning yet to all dictators. The power of truth and technology will always triumph over the rusted guns of the past. We thank you for watching. All information in this report is intended to reflect objective reality and does not target any specific individual or organization.